This panel is moderated by Dr. Brad Johnson, a professor of psychology in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law. This is panel number 3, Leading from Within.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Brad Johnson. I'm glad you're here for the final panel of our leadership conference. The focus of this panel, which aligns nicely with our overall theme, is leading from within. And some of the salient kind of themes and questions here. Effective leaders develop self-awareness about their essential personality traits, their emotional habits, and the way they typically respond to stress. Accomplished leaders also tend to surround themselves with a constellation of caring straight shooters who they trust to give them honest feedback if they become overwhelmed or ineffective. When I heard these questions, I thought, now I get why they asked a clinical psychologist to moderate this panel. And I hope it won't bother any of the panelists that while they're sharing about their personality and response to stress, I'll be listening and nodding knowingly here. All right, so my plan is to quickly introduce each of them in turn and let them share a few minutes about their own reflection on leading from within. I shared with them earlier 3 sort of defining questions, and I want to share those with you. And as you hear them respond to these, I'd love you to be percolating about these. And after they're finished, we'll come back to you and have some great interaction. And I hope some of these questions resonate with you. So here they are. What elements of your own personality did you have to become aware of and come to terms with early in your career in order to become an effective leader? Second, describe a moment in your career when you had to come to terms with the necessity of self-compassion. And how do you engage in self-care even today? And last, when it comes to feedback about your personal well-being and professional competence, who do you rely on to give you honest and unvarnished feedback? So with that, let me introduce our first panelist. We have a really remarkable lineup here, and I think you'll be amazed. So I'm going to begin with Brigadier General retired Dana Bourne. She is an Air Force Academy grad and holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from Penn State. She served 2 terms as a presidentially appointed dean of the faculty of the Air Force Academy. During an impressive career as an Air Force officer, she was a speechwriter to the Secretary of the Air Force and a squadron commander for the 11th Mission Support Squadron, both in DC and Afghanistan. And since her retirement, she has served as the co-director for the Center of Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School. She also happens to be a dear friend, and I will tell you, you just will not encounter a more competent and thoughtful person. How's that? Okay, all right, so
There's
please
only one way to go, and that's down.
Please help me welcome General Bourne here.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and it is a pleasure to say this is a small world, and I've been working with Dr. Brad Johnson probably for the last 20 years as our paths overlap with the American Psychological Association and the Division on Military Psychology, and we've been doing some work together recently as well. So it's wonderful to be here and to be able to say hello again and to share our passion for developing public leaders. I also am very honored the panelists that we have here, and I don't want to spend a lot of time because it's so little time, and we really want to engage with each and every one of you and entertain the questions that you have. I'd like to start by saying, since I retired, the week after retirement, I started teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School, and they asked me why I wanted to join them. And I said, well, you say that you're about ask what you can do to make the world a better place, imagine what we can do together. And I've been kind of invested and passionate about developing principled public leaders for my entire 30-plus years in the United States Air Force. So it's been a wonderful journey to continue in this mission to help people be successful, to make democracies work here and to create a safer environment for all around the world. I would share that I am in a mixed marriage. I am an Air Force Academy graduate, class of 1983. However, the last time I was in this auditorium was for my husband's, he's a class of 1975 Naval Academy reunion, and if you remember that, game. We did not show up, I don't think, for that game, and I was sitting right over there, and I'm having a little bit of post-traumatic stress at the moment because that was quite some day. Also, my daughter, our oldest, is a junior at the Air Force Academy right now, and our younger daughter is visiting here and has been offered an appointment in the class of 2023. So it's a real pleasure to be here. We're really all one team. I teach authentic leadership development as part of my duties at the Kennedy School. And in that approach, it's really very similar to the theme for this conference and also the theme of this panel. And there are three cross-cutting themes which I think resonate for me now more than ever. Number one is the compelling evidence that being self-aware and being self-accepting is so critical for us being effective in our leadership. And it's not a solo journey. Some people say self-awareness is just that inward journey. But we don't know a lot if we don't know how others experience us, and also how others experience themselves as a result of us and our leadership. So it's actually not a solo journey. Having said that, we don't want to be defined by others. And one of the differences is that when we are focused on our values and our ethical boundaries, then we're much more likely to be accepting of ourselves and aware of ourselves without being thrown around by others' expectations. Another part of it, the teaching, which I've become even more enamored with, is Carol Dweck's work out of Stanford on the importance of having a learning and a growth mindset. And that's kind of about ourselves, learning about ourselves, but it's also about empowering other people. And so where we might want to judge someone based on they're either good at this or they're not good at that, or we want to judge ourselves even more harshly, sometimes it's better to default from that judgment of certainty to jump into the curiosity of I wonder. And with that, if I change my strategy, perhaps I could get better at, the 10,000 hours of work. A quick aside, I grew up thinking I couldn't sing because when I joined the choir with my sister, the choir director came up to me after our first opening number and said, "Honey, it's okay if you just lip it." And I went, ouch. And I sang Happy Birthday with just lipping it for probably 20-some years until I realized I actually could hold a tune if somebody sang on tune in my ear. So a little bit of change of strategy. So having curiosity is important. And then finally, I call it the I and the me to we. I and me is not something we tend to think about a lot because we are part of something bigger than ourselves. Most everybody is in the service academy or becoming a public servant to be someone who is going to contribute to something bigger. And yet you want to jump right into the we, the collective work of getting the mission done. But the I and the me and who you are is really, and why you are, is a critically important part of that. And so those are kind of three cross-cutting themes that I have embraced a little bit more in my time to actually be able to reflect on those as I teach authentic leadership. Now, who you are and why you are is something that is probably the most important question to ask yourself and for us to ask ourselves to be effective. And Mark Twain has a quote, the two most important days of your life are the day that you're born and the day you figure out why. And so a big part of it is why are we? And if we get to the end of our lives, how do we consider it to be a success? And how do you kind of write the history of your future now? And for each of us, that's different. I'll share my why is, and your why is probably tied to your life story, and it's probably tied to something that you really get angry about, because the flip side of what really makes you angry is probably the thing that you're really passionate about. And that is really your purpose and your passion. Mine comes from having a severe learning disability when I was little and being put into a class for those that have mental retardation. And my mother identified in me that just didn't seem to fit and got me some help, totally turned me around. You can tell 2 master's degree, PhD, dean at the academy, and now Harvard professor. my life changed course dramatically because of that. And so I get really angry when people aren't allowed to reach their fullest potential. I get really passionate about developing people to reach their fullest potential. And so my who I am and my why I am are things I think about each day in terms of trying to figure out what I say yes to and what do I say no to stay on my course. And my hope is that the panel today will help you figure out yours a little bit more clearly and to go off in that direction with your passion, your purpose, and to make the world a better place. So it's wonderful to be here. I look forward to the questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dana. So I'd like to now introduce Major General retired Charles Bolden, Marine Corps. He's a former administrator of NASA and a former NASA astronaut. He's a Naval Academy graduate and served as a Marine aviator and test pilot. General Bolden was assigned to multiple commands, including the Deputy Command of U.S. Forces in Japan. He was nominated by President Barack Obama as the administrator of NASA and was confirmed by the Senate in 2009. And in this season, we're honoring the legacy of Dr. King. I just want to point out that he was the first African American to ever be the appointed leader of NASA. So please welcome Major General Bolden.
Thanks very much. Thank you. You know, when Brad asked us to kind of think a little bit, reflect a little bit on knowing ourselves first, leading from within, it was pretty easy for me because I'm not the person I seem to be sometimes. And every time I tell people who I think I am, they say, no way. One, I'm introverted extremely. I think my biggest lack is a lack of self-confidence. And if you look at how I've done everything throughout my life, it becomes very apparent that I was able to overcome those two faults, if you will. And I don't think they're faults, those two characteristics. I never dreamed of being an astronaut, never dreamed of flying airplanes. In fact, when I grew up in the segregated South, in Columbia, South Carolina, two things I knew for certain in 7th grade, and some of the midshipmen here, or some of the graduates have probably heard me tell my story about seeing a program on television called Men of Annapolis when I was in 7th grade. I was 12 years old, and I said, that's where I'm going to school. Didn't make any difference that there weren't very many of me here at the time, but I was going to school there. I didn't want to go anywhere else except the Naval Academy, and so I started learning how you get here, how you get an appointment, and all that other kind of stuff. And long story short, in spite of not being able to get an appointment from my home state, I rose from my lack of self-confidence and my introverted nature, and I wrote a letter to the president. And at the time, it was President Lyndon Johnson, who had just become president because of the assassination of John Kennedy, my senior year in high school. Never heard from him, but the next thing I knew was I had a knock on the door from a Navy recruiter, and later a retired federal judge that President Johnson had decided he was going to do something to increase the diversity in the military academies. Didn't have women yet, but people were thinking about it, and so I ended up getting an appointment from Congressman William Dawson in Chicago, Illinois. That's the way I came here. My first company officer was a Marine who I fell in love with. He was absolutely incredible. John Riley Love, the late John Riley Love, but he inspired me in every way. He was like my dad. He was really tough, but eminently fair. And so although he was only here my plebe year, after that, he was always the person that I thought about when it was decision-making time or how do you want to do something? And so he so inspired me that I decided against my better judgment that I would become a Marine, which really did not sit well with anyone in my family, let alone my soon-to-be wife, when I graduated. So I became a Marine. And then not wanting to fly airplanes because I thought it was inherently dangerous, the thing I did wrong was I married a woman who did not want me to be a ground Marine. And so she kept going after me. I found out in basic school I didn't like crawling around in the mud. And I took the only alternative available. I used my little aviation option out of the Naval Academy and went to flight school and fell in love with it. So those kind of point out how you have to go with the flow. You take advantage of opportunities that come your way. And no matter how uncomfortable you may be with your ability to do something, you do the absolute best that you can and then go with it. The last thing I'll share with you is it's a sort of three bones I must say, this is not mine. This is from one of the greatest civil servants I ever had the privilege of working with next to President Obama, and that was a guy named Robert Lightfoot, who was the COO, if you will. He was the Associate Administrator for NASA, the senior civil servant for most of my 8 years as the NASA Administrator. And he's a guy that I grew to respect and admire incredibly well. And he was the longest serving acting NASA Administrator after I left, because it took forever for the present administration to decide to put somebody in as the NASA Administrator. But I learned a lot about leadership from Robert. He used to have talks called Lightfoot on Leadership, and I listened to him all the time. But I will offer to all the students here particularly, but to all of us, 3 bones that we all have, or we should have. One of them is a backbone. And everybody this morning talked about that. When you talked about the courage to lead, when you talked about making decisions, very difficult moral decisions in times of crises, that's when your backbone, it kind of shakes you, and you say, well, I really do have one, and I can stand up to the ridicule and the criticism that I'm going to get. So everybody has one. We just have to learn how to use it. The second bone is your wishbone. You have to have dreams and aspirations. And I love what I do today. Somebody mentioned it this morning, but I don't think I've had a day in my life other than the death of my mom and dad. Maybe when we lost Challenger and when we lost Dr. King and President Kennedy, there are not a lot of times that I can think back and say, boy, I had a bad day. For 8 years, almost 8 years, I would get up from my bed early in the morning to go into the gym, and I was driving up along the Potomac River, and I'd just be thinking about what a horrible day this was going to be, because I knew I was going to be meeting with some world leader or something else as the NASA Administrator, and my calendar said this is going to be a dog shit day. And I'd go to work, and I'd get through the day, and I'd get back in my car at night, and I'd be driving home down the Potomac looking at the beauty of it, and I'd just smile, and I'd say, man, I can't believe it. This was an absolutely incredible day, because we made life better for somebody today. And every single one of you do that, whether you know it or not. Every single one of you touches the life of somebody in your circle, your sphere of influence. Several people said it this morning, you can't do anything about things that are out of your control, but you can do everything about you and the decisions you make. And so when I search internally, I'm always wondering, what the hell am I doing here? You know, how did I get to do this? I mean, I could think of 1,000 people that I think are more qualified than I am to be here. How did I get to do this? Well, that ain't my fault. You know, I didn't put me there. Somebody else put me here for some reason, so I'm going to make the best of it that I can. So don't beat yourselves up trying to figure out what the heck you're doing there. You're there because somebody saw something in you, and you can make the best of it. So look forward to taking your questions and talking a little bit more also.
All right, excellent, thank you. Our next panelist is Lieutenant General Retired Tom Metz, U.S. Army. He's a graduate of West Point, achieving the rank of Lieutenant General in the Army before his retirement in 2010 after more than 40 years of service to the Army. During his illustrious career as an Army officer, he served as Director, Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization. That is very cool, I'm just going to say. Deputy Commanding General and Chief of Staff of the Army Training and Doctrine Command, and also the Commanding General of the U.S. Third Corps. So please help me in welcoming General Metz.
When I got the invitation to join you, continued to double check that everyone realized that I was a United States Military Academy graduate, and everybody acknowledged, so I guess it was okay. Well, then I took a step further and I said, may I come for the whole conference? And they said yes, and it has been a great conference. I've got tons of notes of things that I would like to share with you, most of which are adding to what you've already heard. There's been so much wisdom. I hope you've taken great notes, because you could really walk away from this conference with all the tools to be a great leader, not only in the U.S. Navy or the United States Marine Corps, but all sorts of walks of life. You'd have plenty in your kit bag to be a successful leader. I think with the question I'm going to take on that our moderator asked us was, who do you turn to? And the first place you should always turn, though, is, as the theme of the conference and the theme of this panel, is internal. That's the first place you need to look. But what you need to do throughout your career, and it's not just service career, it's all careers, is find mentors along the way. And mentors can come, obviously, from more senior leaders that you've gotten to know, but mentors can also be peers, and they can also be subordinates. They're people that you trust and have admired the way that they have led. I was blessed throughout my career to have really unbelievably great leaders whom I respected, I learned from, and it made a tremendous difference, because I didn't necessarily, although I did on occasions take a really tough problem and say, hey boss, how would you solve this problem? Or how would you go about this? But I didn't have to do that all the time, because I knew them well enough that when I looked inside to get to the essence of the problem that I was wrestling, I would ask myself, what would General Hartzog, for example, I'm 15 years into my career. I'm a pretty cocky major. I'm running a big mechanized brigade for the commander. He takes command. About 2 days later, I realized I'm in the audience of one of the smartest soldiers I had ever known, and I better start taking notes. But I could go internal and say to myself, what would General Hartzog do in this case? Later on, I commanded the 2nd Brigade of the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division, and then became the Chief of Staff of the division. This little wiry Texan, General Randy House, takes command of the division. One of the most disciplined people I have ever known. He is an easy one to open my soul and ask, what would General House do in this case? But I've got a great friend and peer here, John Sadler. I can look in there and say, what would Sadler do? First of all, he'd laugh at me, and then we would get on with the seriousness of what I'm inspecting myself for. Or I could go to my great Command Sergeant Major Joe Gainey, who went to the sound of the guns in Iraq every time he heard them. Unbelievable soldier. We came back from Iraq, in fact, and General Pace called me, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and asked me if Sergeant Major Gainey could be his first senior enlisted advisor to the chairman. And like I'm going to tell the chairman, no. Of course he can. And I ran down the hallway and told Joe he better get ready because General Pace is going to call him. But that was the kind of soldier he was. And so I could look in and ask myself, what would Sergeant Major Gainey do in this case? So you'll run across, during your careers in and out of the service, great leaders whom you can literally turn to, and they will want to help. I mean, I am here because I feel like after those 40 years, I owe a lot, and I'm going to pay it back. And you will meet those kinds of leaders along the way. Foster that friendship. Don't feel bad about actually calling them up or going to visit and getting good counsel. But my suggestion is always go inside, because most of the time asking what would General House, what would General Hartzog, what would John Sattler, what would Sergeant Major Gainey do in this case, you'll have the answer. So from within, that's one of the ways. I've got plenty of notes, and let's get on with continued introductions.
Thank you, General. All right, our last and distinguished, I will say, panelist, Natalie LaBorde, JD, just flew in from New Orleans, is that right? Okay. So currently serves as Executive Counsel and Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Louisiana Department of Corrections. During the 2017 legislative session, she co-led current Louisiana Governor Edwards' landmark criminal justice reform effort. From 2010 to 15, she served in various roles for previous Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal, including Deputy Chief of Staff, Policy Director, and Assistant Executive Counsel to the Governor. Prior to law school, Ms. LaBorde served in Sydney, Australia, where she worked for A21 campaign, an international anti-trafficking organization. Please help us welcome Ms. LaBorde.
I just want to start off to quote the Major General. I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing here? Sitting next to these incredibly distinguished public servants. And I personally want to thank you all, because I'm definitely at a different point in my career. And so it's very inspiring to be with all of you here today. And just to your point about the people finding mentors and people invest in you, I really am, I'm a product of that. I'm a product of some people who took my hand early on, whether it was in college or the beginning of my professional career, who really took the time to invest in me and use their life and their own past career and personal stories to give me a leg up, per se. You know, here's what I did wrong, here's what I did right, you can learn from me and stand on my shoulders. So that's kind of the context in which I speak to you all today. For me personally, in terms of the self-awareness, I would say I kind of got thrown into that, about the self-awareness component, while at the same time navigating early on in my career. As he mentioned in my bio, I started right out of law school working for Governor Jindal, who was the governor at the time. And as anyone who's worked in government and politics, things change very quickly. So I started off as a staff attorney, but woke up one day and was told I was going to be a criminal justice and public safety policy advisor, a lot of which I knew nothing about. I had taken one criminal law class, so I had to learn very quickly on the job. And then also I was in charge of managing people and being the liaison between the governor and people who were much more advanced in their career, much older and wiser than I was. And to be honest with you, it was challenging. I was a little insecure about it, thinking, how can I come in here and in some ways direct people who have so much more experience than I do. And it really caused a lot of self-reflection for me. And first, being able to acknowledge and being comfortable saying, look, I don't have the experience of some of these people. I know where my lane is, and I know where it's not. And I really developed my own leadership style through that particular point in my career. I learned that buy-in is really my style. I don't need to walk in and give a directive to the majority of my team members. That's implied by my title sometimes, but that was a really important learning lesson for me and self-awareness. And then also one of the challenges that no one really told me I would face in terms of when I transitioned into a manager or a leader of my own team is that, a lot of these, I'm sure everyone in here is very driven, disciplined, type A manager, or type A person. We're used to being competitive. We're used to, fighting to get where we are. And suddenly I transitioned into this role where I was responsible for this team. My main goal was not only to make sure that we succeeded as a team, but that they succeeded as people in their professional careers, much like people had done for me. And that was, I'll be honest with you, it was a bit of a fight at first, because you struggle thinking, well, what if I invest in them so much and then they surpass me? They get the promotion that I was looking for. But it was such a great learning experience for me as a person, and I really think that I grew in my own personal character and just my role as a leader and a manager. And then to your point, sir, just again about, I think there's such an important component is having those people in your life. For me, I call them accountability, whether it's professional or personal, people that I trust implicitly, that I know that their life story, and I'm willing to have the hard conversations with them about, this is what I'm dealing with personally, this is what I'm dealing with in my job, this is some management struggles I'm having, and those things have been such lifesavers for me. It really anchored me, and I think that the degree to which I've been able to grow and succeed in my career path is really directly attributed to those people in my life who have held me accountable. And then lastly, my charge to all of you would be, I think it's clear that everyone's here because they have a commitment to public service and something greater than ourselves. And don't ever minimize that. I think one of the most invigorating things about what I'm doing professionally now is that I get to see the merge between the public policy component, which is intellectually stimulating for me, and the impact that it has on real human beings. Not only in our state, like from the prison population, things like that, but even directly in my own office. There are some of the guys that are our orderlies that now received an opportunity for a chance at parole because of the things that we stayed up late at night and worked on and forfeited our weekends, that we crunched, sat there and typed out drafts of laws that in the moment seemed very tedious, but one day I got to wake up and see, wow, this actually impacted a person's life. So I would tell you, as you're entering into that phase of your life, don't ever minimize that. Really let that be a guiding force in what you pick in your career path. That's all I have.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Ms. LaBorde. All right, well, we've got 2 microphones here, and we've got about half an hour left. And so, yeah, I already see a few brave folks coming forward. So if you've been percolating on some of what you've been hearing and maybe putting some themes together, have questions, would like elaboration, we can get some great interaction going here among our panelists. So thanks for leading off. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you all for all coming. I'm Robert Pickering from Laurel, Mississippi. My question's for General Bolden. Your insight would be much valued. You had a really interesting metaphor earlier. Is the final bone the funny bone or the humorous?
The funny bone, and you're like my wife. I need to explain that. I've stopped holding up my fingers. My wife says, don't do that, because we were talking about memory earlier. You never remember how many fingers you stuck up. And you'll say, I'm going to tell you about 3 things, and you get to 2, and you forget the other one. So the third one was the funny bone. And the purpose for that one was don't take yourself seriously. And several speakers last night and today have said the same thing. The person that you need to enjoy the most is you. If you can't laugh at yourself, let me tell you, your days are going to suck. Because we do some absolutely hilarious stuff if we will allow ourselves to step back and say, that was the dumbest thing I ever, how did I do that? So the funny bone, you're right.
Thank you.
Any other questions coming to mind for anybody? Got somebody coming forward here. If there are others, feel free to queue up. You don't have to wait till someone wraps up. Go ahead and jump in. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Midshipman First Class Brown, United States Naval Academy. My question is in regard for the entire panel. What books have you read helped develop you the most?
Wow.
So what books have been those books that kind of linger in terms of making a real impact on your life and leadership?
I suggest you pick up Audible if you're like me. Because if I answered the question honestly, I'd say I haven't read a book in years. Audible has saved me. And I have devoured about 12 books over the last year because I'm a bicycle rider. So I listen to books when I'm riding. I listen while I'm driving. And it's cheating. But if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, or something like that. But I think one is Secretary Madeleine Albright's Fascism, absolutely incredible, and I highly recommend it to everybody in the audience if you haven't read it. Michelle Obama's book on being is I devoured that one because I could identify with almost every single thing she talked about in the book, and I think that's what makes it so good is that she wrote it as if she were one of you sitting down there. So those are just 2 lately.
I think it's a great question, and the fact that you're asking it says that leaders are readers and readers are leaders, even if it's Audible. And I've done many Audible myself as I'm out hiking. I actually have a list of books that have shaped my thinking about leadership in particular. I actually love to read leadership books, and so the latest one I read, actually one of the best is, because I teach authentic leadership, is Discover Your True North, and that's really the pedagogy of thinking about who are you and why are you. But the latest book I read was Brene Brown's Braving the Wilderness. I think the power of our vulnerability and focusing on our strengths such that our weaknesses become irrelevant. You need to know what they are, but focusing on our strengths is really where we bring something into this world and not trying to make our weaknesses a strength that it'll just take all our energy. So that's the latest one I read.
Any others?
Sure.
Yeah.
to couple with what you said, one of the most influential, I would say, in the last year or two is a book called Leading with a Limp, and it's by Dan Allender, and it's actually, he is a psychologist, but same concept about being aware of your humanity, not seeking perfection, and ways that we can grow in our strengths and also be comfortable with our weaknesses as well. And then another one, just because of the public policy area that I work in, is Leading in the Public Square by Oskinus. And again, he is a British political philosopher / commentator, and he just talks about the role of plurality of thought and how we can balance those against some of the tendency to push back on competing interests or competing ideals. So for me, yeah, those have been the most influential in the last couple of years.
I'm like my great Marine colleague. I drive a lot, so I listen a lot to books. The latest, or one of the latest that really impacted me, was an autobiography of General Grant. I've always been a student of the Civil War. I think I always criticize the Europeans for not paying attention, because the carnage of the First World War may have been somewhat bypassed if they had realized what was changing. But war was changing into total war. It was moving into the industrial age with trains and telegraphs, and the change was coming, and Grant recognized that. But after he finishes the war off as a general and becomes president, the leadership that he showed to help the reconstruction of our country and holding it together is pretty important. So that would be one that I would throw out to you. But I think reading and studying is the way to continue to absorb. Our brains can hold a lot, and so don't feel like you're getting overloaded, because it'll hold everything you'll put in there, and it'll show up when you need it, and continue your personal education. That's a strong piece of advice.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Let's go to this side.
Good afternoon. I am Midshipman 4th Class Wyatt Ebner from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. This one's geared more towards the military leaders. How does the mentoring you receive from NCOs evolve throughout your career as an officer?
So how has the mentoring from NCOs really affected your who you are as a leader?
Well, I had the advantage of being a private in the United States Army in 1966 and 67. Fortunately, I got out of basic training and went to the West Point Prep School, which at the time was at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. But I was a volunteer, and the entire United States Army were full of draftees, and so I had to grow up. And so when I made it through the 4 years at West Point, I was commissioned an infantry officer and reported to my first unit. I had classmates that didn't seem like they were doing very well, and I seemed to be doing okay. But it was because I went to the non-commissioned officer first with the question of, how do we do this? What is to be done? And it wasn't that I was degrading myself or going the wrong way. It was, that's where the answers are. At the tactical level, certainly in Army units, I think it would be the same in Marine units and naval units, and Air Force units. I think that the non-commissioned officers, their career path is pretty much down a skill set that they get to know very, very well. An officer over time will be continuing to move across a much broader spectrum. But if you need the details of that particular skill set, the best place to go is a non-commissioned officer. And I hope I'm answering the question, but that's my strong advice. Never hesitate. Never feel like you're going the wrong direction by going to a great non-commissioned officer, because they, in our great armed forces, they really are the backbone.
And can I just, I have to echo that. You should never be the smartest person in the room, number one. If you are, you're in trouble, because you grossly overestimate, your own ability and wisdom. But you should always be the one that's willing to ask the dumb question. Everybody got accustomed, working with me, to know that I was going to say, hey, there are no dumb questions. Because if there's one question that somebody wants to ask, I can guarantee there are a few more people who are just embarrassed to ask it because they feel they should know the answer. So never, ever, ever be embarrassed about asking a question, and particularly asking it of your NCOs. They're kind of, I call myself a participatory leader, but people hate it because I'm very deliberative, but I want to hear from everybody in the unit before I make a decision. You know, there are very few things I think that require a leader to just say, boom, let's go do this now. And you'll never be betrayed by asking everybody all the way down as low as you can find, because the people that are going to have to execute are not the people with you in the room, probably.
And I'll just add a quick, what came to mind right away and actually to heart was I had an opportunity to command during 9/11 in Washington, D.C., and most of my unit was enlisted personnel. And I think what I learned was the value of overestimation of people, and they will surpass what you even overestimate. And senior NCOs, I learned with many who were decorated for going above and beyond the call of duty when 9/11 happened, who would have thought in our nation, they turned that around in overestimating, in other words, supporting my command effectiveness. And so I think that when you believe that people have more than they are showing, that actually comes back as a gift to you as a leader and a commander.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to be here. My name is Midshipman Second Class Donald Lofi from the U.S. Naval Academy. My question is for Major General. Major General, you talked about how you struggle with self-confidence growing as a leader. And I think we all do to some degree, whether we would like to admit it or not. And especially in the military, sometimes we get the perception that military leaders cannot be self-conscious and they can't doubt themselves. But you obviously have had a very distinguished career, and I would like to ask, how did you overcome your self-confidence or self-confidence issues and rise to success?
Believe it or not, I think it's a gift to be quite honest. I speak a lot, and people say, boy, you don't ever get nervous. I said, au contraire. If I ever get ready to stand up in front of a group and and my stomach is not churning, I think seriously about turning around and going back and trying to make sure I'm in the right place, because I think you have to have a teeny bit of doubt in whether or not you're going to be able to rise to the occasion of what you're being asked to do, because it'll cause you to think a little bit more about what you want to do. And because you're going to be in the business of people, everything you decide is potentially going to impact somebody else. And so it's always good to have a sense of, some sense of modesty in addition to your ego or whatever it is. I'm not trying to say that I've got an ego like everybody else, but I think my lack of confidence all the time is a gift. Yeah.
All right, thank you, sir.
Excellent. All right.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Midshipman Robertson, Auburn University. My question is for the panel in general. In nearly every level of leadership, you are both a leader and a follower. So what advice can you give as a peer leader, for a junior officer, part of a wardroom, to lead those around him and further support the vision of the command?
Wow. Yeah. So how do you do both kinds of leadership? Leading down, leading up, leading sideways?
Yes, sir.
Want to tackle that?
Sure. I think you make an excellent point. And someone once told me, it's one thing to learn how to lead, but in order to lead effectively, you need to learn how to follow. And for me personally, the real learning experience for me for that is I got really involved when I was in college, just with my church community. I did a lot of community outreach in North Baton Rouge that had lower income families. And the mantra was, for us, was we don't pick up a title, we pick up a towel. Yeah. And I really learned servant leadership there, that all these people were coming together to use the gifts and talents and abilities that they had in their lives to really impact another person. And I learned how to follow there. I had a lot of people that I served underneath, and it really, really impacted my own leadership style. So I would say find find opportunities to get involved where you are following. And I know that's implied working specifically in the military. But outside of that, find opportunities to serve. And I think by default, it's going to impact your own leadership style. You'll learn how to follow and by default also how to lead.
You allow me to go cover one of the things that I was itching to cover here. Those of you taking notes can draw this. Others will have to envision it. But think of the circular target, the bullseye, and 2 more rings. And in the outer ring, put the word what. In the middle ring, put the word how. And in the center, put why. Because what will happen is we're hard-charging type A folks, and we're going to be given a mission, and we're just going to jump in, and we'll probably know what to do. That comes pretty easy. And then we can go to those NCOs or whomever and figure out all the how to do it. But the real essence to leadership is knowing why you're doing it. And so there will be times when I should have, but later on learn this. If the boss didn't tell me why, I ask him why or her why. Because knowing the why first helps build the right how and whats. And so in that little picture, it is most common to work outside in, but if you'll be disciplined enough to work inside out, get the question why determined first, other pieces will fall into place.
Any other reflections on this one?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a John F. Kennedy quote because it's effort and courage isn't enough without purpose and direction, and the purpose and direction is really the why.
Thank you so much for your insight.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Midshipman 3rd Class Nathan Lee from the United States Naval Academy. My question is for the entire panel. Sir and ma'am, how do you retain efficacy as a leader and continue to take care of your people when you yourself may be going through personally tumultuous times?
This is such a great question. It really aligns with the whole theme here. So when you're struggling yourself or suffering or not up to par, how do you lead through that, or what do you do?
Oh, this, if I could share, because my heart rate just went up thinking about this. And, I go back to your funny bone. One of my lowest points in my career as a general officer was I went into my boss's office, and 3-star general, and offered and tendered my resignation. And it was over principle, and he put it in his drawer, and he said, "You of all people know now is not a good idea to make this decision. So go into my restroom, fix yourself up, and get back into the meeting," kind of thing. And I went into the restroom, I looked in the mirror, and I went, man, I look horrible. I hadn't slept all night. I got up at 3 o'clock to I was awake, but to draft the resignation letter. And I looked in the mirror, and all I could think was, this is horrible. And I walked out, and he just looked up at me, and I don't know what came over me, but I said, "Sir, there's a problem with your restroom. It lacks mascara." And, we both kind of laughed. But it was a real low moment, and I had lost my way because it was an investigation that I felt like the bullseye was on my chest, and I was looking at everything being thrown at me, and I had lost sight of the responsibilities I was given and the longer-term view, which is a natural thing when you feel as though it's personal, and it really wasn't. And it was Sully Sullenberger who basically woke me up. He was speaking to the 4,000 cadets, and one of the cadets, like you, came up and asked a question, said, "Mr. Sullenberger, did you ever think about failure on that day on the, landing a plane on the Hudson?" And he said, "Absolutely not. I thought of success in solving one thing to the next." And it was like a light bulb went up in my head, and I went, I've kind of lost my way. I need to kind of focus more on the long term. And so self-care is incredibly important. I had lost my way and got woken up to say, no, people are relying on you. I had 900 faculty, staff, 4,000 students, and a mission. And it wasn't about me. It was about them.
I'll share a real dark day in my career. I was commanding the 3rd Corps. I knew a whole lot about the Operation Iraqi Freedom because I was the Chief of Staff at Central Command before I became the 3rd Corps Commander. And things obviously didn't go exactly the way we wanted to, and so we needed to turn over the units. So we began to number Operation Iraqi Freedom 1, and I was to take the 3rd Corps and relieve the 5th Corps in Iraq for Operation Iraqi Freedom 2. I was required to go to a very, very, very senior leader in the Department of Defense. It turned out to be a summer home, so I flew into a strange location and drove up in the mountains and had a long interview because he wanted to know the next commander that was going in. I got back, I felt very confident. I called my boss and told him I thought I had a great interview and I thought everything went fine. And then a very good friend of mine who was working in Washington and was plugged into all the rumors called me and wanted to alert me that this very high defense official had decided that I wasn't tough enough for the job. And that was kind of a spear in the heart. But I couldn't do anything about it. I was very disappointed and angry and all the emotions that would come. But I stayed confident because I knew I could do the job and continued to lead the Corps and get ready to go and do all the things I needed to do. And it turned out that we go all the way back to our discussion about mentors. When this rumor starts moving around, the mentors rose up and attacked. And I got to be the 3rd Corps commander who took the Corps headquarters and relieved the 5th Corps. And later we came reorganized in the multinational Corps Iraq and with the tremendous Marines of the first MEF and all that were out in the multinational force West Iraq in the Second Battle of Fallujah. We accomplished that victory, which led, in my opinion, to a very successful election in Iraq's first free election in January 2005. So you can have dark, dark days, but the positive look, you'll find a way to the light at the end of the tunnel, and it'll all work out. Just have faith in yourself.
All right. Excellent.
Thank you very much.
You want to jump in?
Hello, my name is Josiah Johnson. I'm from College of the Ozarks. And you all discussed the importance of having value and finding a purpose and a drive for yourself. And if you recall back to the second panel we had, or the first panel we had today, they discussed the importance of meditation and reflection. And I was curious to see, in your all's experience in life, if you had useful and tangible tips for us to be able to better reflect and meditate on the time we have in our day and the decisions we made that day, because it's simple in concept but hard in implementing. So.
Good. So self-reflection, meditation.
That's why I ride a bicycle. I used to run. One of the things about military people is I'm preaching to the choir here. The thing I loved about being here my 1 year as the deputy commandant was how young I got trying to keep up with all of you. Because without knowing it, you take time every single day to meditate. You know, how many times do you run around the yard? And if you're not with a team or something where you're chanting, you're thinking. And you need to understand that that's an incredibly valuable time to kind of reflect on what's happened to you that day, what didn't go right, what do I want to do tomorrow. It's the best time. I find I get up in the morning, I get on my bicycle, and I go. I happen to be able to ride on the Mount Vernon Trail, so not only do I enjoy riding, but I have probably one of the most beautiful views of anybody year-round going up and down the river. But I think it's really important. I didn't think about it until this morning when people talked about reflecting and meditating, but I find that that's what I like so much about riding a bicycle, is because it gives me a period of time to be alone and to think about things I've done wrong, things I would like to fix, people I've offended, things I want to go back and say, boy, I really, I was not very kind yesterday, and I'd like to can I take that back? And that kind of stuff. So.
And thinking about development, which is really your question, is, growing. And a lot of times we just go from experience to experience to experience, and we don't take the time to reflect. And sometimes you almost have to, it happens naturally when we fail, right? Because we don't like that, and we go, why did that happen? But to have a practice to be ready for the experience, to, in the experience, kind of give yourself tough love. The grown zone is the growth zone, and then take the time to reflect. It's a critical part of that development, so you kind of, your life is more in an upward spiral of learning and not flat or the opposite, right? So a reflective practice can be a positive one. There's research that says if you for 2 weeks write down 3 things that you're happy about at the end of each day next to your bed, there are benefits that go with that. But it has to be a practice. For me, it used to be running. I was 12 letters at the Air Force Academy. Now my kids say it's wogging, which I think is a walk jog, and that's on a good day. But that's mine. It's a reflective getting out in nature and taking that time to just let thoughts kind of settle. And prayer. I mean, everybody has a different way of meditation, or for me, it's prayer time.
I'll add to that. I think practically journaling is really helpful, and I'm not just talking about, this is something I implement in my own life, and it's been helpful for me to look back and read times where I was facing an obstacle and then see how it resolved itself, and it just kind of rejuvenates me. Like Natalie back then, 2 years ago, worked through this whole thing. So Natalie today, what she's facing, can work through the same thing. So I think it's just I think it's called the art of remembering, just remembering your own story and where you've come from, and for, the spiritual component, which is, I'm a person of faith, so that's very important for me personally, and just to see how that's woven throughout my own personal story as well, just looking back and seeing how things have worked out in the past, and it helps you work through it in the future.
Thank you very much.
Got just a couple minutes left here, I think, so jump in.
Hi, my name is Elena Bowman. I'm a junior at St. John's College. I had a question of basically, what does humility really mean to you, and how do you actually practice it?
Yeah, so interesting, and certainly relates to knowing self and doing some self-care. So humility, what does that mean to any of you, and how do you think about it? How do you practice it?
I would tie a quick answer to our very first presentation from Colonel Athens. It's that fulcrum, I think, the selfish or the selfless. As you work to ensure that you're on the selfless leadership side, humility comes with that. And it gives me the opportunity to give you one of the great secrets that I think that I have enjoyed in my career, and that is work hard to use the pronoun we instead of I, because it's your team, and your team needs to be recognized, and using the pronoun we does that. But the real secret is, again, look inside, and are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it for the team? Because if you're trying to get credit yourself, you'll get less and less credit, I guarantee you. But if you're giving credit to your team, the more you give away, the more you'll get. It's unbelievable how few people, it seems like, understand that rule. The more credit you give away, the more you're going to get. The less credit you give away, the less you're going to get. So mixed in there is humility. And I think if you continue to work on it, it starts to become natural, and you're on a home run path.
When I hear the word, I actually hear humility as virtue, and two of the best virtues I think are humility and magnanimity. So humility to me seems to be more of a service. I think going to this other orientation, but it's a service orientation, and magnanimity is kind of like trying to think big to make a big difference from a place of being small. But I hear humility as a service and other oriented as well. And I actually think about that a lot, because I wrestle with the humility being tied to being humble but also humiliated sometimes, and it puts you in that place of being and I don't want to cross into the not having confidence, but the biggest fear in all of us is actually fear of failure. And so I think many we aren't willing to admit that, but I think it comes from a little bit of that, and it can drive us. It can drive us crazy if we let it, but it can drive us also and motivate us to do the big things from a place of being out of service. Or in service, not out of service, in service.
Yeah. And I think practicing saying I don't know frequently is really helpful too. So that's my practice. I don't know.
Thanks.
I think, do we have time for a couple more? I think we do. I'm not getting the shepherd's hook yet, so I think we can keep going. Yeah, jump in.
Hi, my name is Natalie Calderon from California State University Maritime Academy, and my question is for Miss Natalie on the left. What are some failures and challenges you have come across working in public policy, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Sure. And just that you're speaking about failures within public policy development,
Yes,
things
ma'am.
I've worked on that have failed?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I have a lot of those experiences. One, I don't know if that's great for my professional resume, but perfect example would be this past, in 2017 and 2018 when Louisiana pushed forward criminal justice reform. That was a product, the initial recommendations were a product of 2 years of a lot of hard work on the part of 25 plus key stakeholders. A Pew organization came in from DC, and it generated this report that was, if we could get everything that we possibly wanted, this is how we would, this is what we would push forward, this is how we'd move the needle forward. And then, you put that into the actual legislative session, and it's the sausage factory. Essentially, those things that you really, truly, fundamentally believe are right for your state get changed. They become political. They become tied to someone's reelection or whether or not they're going to, is this good for my reelection? Things like that. So you have to. I think my initial experience with that dynamic early on was a bit confusing for me, and quite frankly, I didn't like it, and I was like, I don't want to be a part of this process anymore, because it doesn't matter what's right or wrong, it's about how it affects someone's political career. But I had to step back, and I had a lot of great voices in my life that said, Natalie, this is the process through which change is initiated in your state and ultimately in your country. Do you want to be a part of it, or do you want to sit on the sidelines? And that was really critical for me in sort of getting my mind right and my attitude right about it. And it changed going into it, this mentality of we're going to work for it, we're going to negotiate, we might not get everything, but we're going to come back next year, and we're going to come back next year, and we're going to keep chipping away, we're going to keep plowing concrete. And I think more than anything, those failures really built, well, they weren't failures, they weren't at all, but it really built resilience in me of not giving up, not being disappointed in the strides that we made, and being willing to come back, keep coming back year after year. And that's really, when you look back historically, some of the great movements in our country where people had put in the time 15, 20 plus years before, when it, we didn't hear about those things. We heard about the landmark change that finally made its way across the line.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think we have time for one more, or maybe you're going to wrap us up here.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Midshipman Second Class Hardy. A couple of you mentioned the fact that a leadership environment can be full of a lot of type A personalities. So do you have any advice on how to be a better leader, coming from a sense of being an introvert?
I'm an introvert.
Since I'm the only one that professes to be an introvert, I've listened to everybody, and I just there's a wealth of advice and everything. Couple of things. One is recognize the fact, and I will be repeating myself, recognize the fact that you can't do everything. You can't change everything. Going back to what you just said, there's something you want to get done today, and it just doesn't happen. And it's just not time yet. But don't give up on it. I love to quote a young African boy by the name of Inkosi Johnson, and some of you may have heard his story before. He died of AIDS at the age of 12. And he and his adopted mother, Gail Johnson, had battled the government of South Africa when President Mbeki was the president, and pretended that AIDS did not exist. It was a non-existent disease. And he became very famous because he traveled around the world eventually before he died with Gail Johnson, and he became a UN ambassador for AIDS. And I think it was a UN AIDS conference, he spoke, and an American writer by the name of Jim Wooten heard him, and he went and sat by his bedside when he was about to die, and he said Inkosi was there. He was 12 years old, weighed less than 20 pounds, bones sticking, protruding through his skin and everything, and he had this big smile on his face. And he said he was barking out orders to people, telling them to do this, do that. And he said, stop, you're going to die. And Inkosi said, yep. And he said, well, I don't get it. He said, what makes you tick? People tell me you've never cried out in pain, you've never asked for anything. All you do is want to help everybody else. And he said, Inkosi looked at him and he smiled and he said, you do all you can with what you have in the time that you have in the place that you are. Mm-hmm. And I love to share that saying with people because it's kind of in my own little way. No matter whether I feel like I should be there or not, I'm there for a purpose. And so I try to do everything I can in that period of time. So do all you can with what you have in the time that you have in the place that you are. Not my saying.
And for introverts, there's a book called Quiet, which actually will help you think about the strength of being an introverted leader. It's very powerful. And with type A's, who tend to be perfectionistic, we need to, I think, get more towards a strength-based approach to thinking about our leadership, and not so much the school systems we come up through as a deficit-based. If you get a 90% on a test, you got to figure out what I miss, and it's always about the deficit, but to focus really more on your strengths, I think is a good way to, and Quiet is a good one for introverts.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So let me, with that, just ask you to help me wrap this up by thanking our esteemed panelists, and thanks for being here.